Welcome back to Midgardia Chats. This is part 2 of our Cyberpunk discussion. Let's pick up where we left off.
There's still a lot of technical boundaries to cross, and I feel like socially we also have a boundary to cross with just the anonymity of the internet makes it skews social interactions in a way that's probably really dangerous.
I mean, I've always vastly preferred the anonymity of the internet. I really like the concept, at least in theory. It has not worked, but that with anonymity comes the fact that your idea has to stand on its own, apart from a name that associates what your previous ideas or previous comments would be. Like, I really appreciate that, the thought that each thing that you say, in an anonymous area has to be, it has to stand on its own. It has to be a strong enough argument or a logical enough comment to not kind of ride along on the other stuff you may have said. I love that idea, and unfortunately it hasn't really held up.
Well,
It
it
hasn't
does, actually. It's the same issue as with communism. It works in small groups.
Yeah, that's true. Small doses, small groups, it works great. And then when you take that to 7 billion people, we start getting some negative side effects.
The thing is, it small groups for the same reason groups, which is that everyone knows each other, and everyone there's a sense of nowhere to hide. There's a sense of what you say having consequences, and that's sort of the point of it. Like, I in particular appreciate the anonymity of the internet. I'm a transgender woman. When people know that about me, people tend to respond negatively, and being able to control that level of information is really powerful and important. But
Mhm.
at the same time, it also, like, the kind of the kind of callousness and inhumanity that comes from the internet comes from, I think, not only that anonymity, but also in some ways what you were just saying about how ideas have to stand on their own and arguments must be logical and reasonable. And while that certainly is possible on the internet, that's not how humans work. We don't respect logical arguments. We pretend we do, but all of our decision making is so fundamentally emotional and is based on so many things like body language and tone of voice that the internet prevents us from accessing at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the long-standing thing of a comment that might seem either neutral or even angry on the internet, if said face to face, wouldn't seem that way at all, because we can understand things like sarcasm or tone of voice and body language will make the exact same words seem utterly different offline.
Exactly.
We're also trying to take for the most part, analog system and apply it to a digital logic, like the yes or no, a binary logic, and people, like, you're going to get those people who understand that, and
Mhm.
then because of it, not everyone's going to understand it.
But
You're gonna
it's an
get-
interest. Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, you're going to get people like, okay, no, I don't get this. This is dumb, or this is like, what are you trying to show off? And now they're anonymous, so like you said, there's no social repercussion. I can just call this guy a dickbag and like, oh no, there's no harm in that, and you can probably be talking to him the next day and be like, have a conversation, realize, not know that you were, or like cussing him out the day before.
People are more likely to treat people differently on the internet because we don't read text on a screen as a person the same way we read seeing someone or hearing a voice. There's a lot of research on this, and we're just more callous on the internet.
It's this interesting thing that, like, until really the internet, speech and writing were quite separate, right? The way you would write a letter to someone, the longer form conversation or like that sort of thing that you would have, it is worded quite differently, it's created quite differently, and also consumed differently than speech. But now that we're on the internet, we're trying to use writing to emulate speech. Like, that's things you would see on, forums and boards, Twitter, all those sort of, like, IRC. We're trying to use written language to replace spoken language, and like they are fundamentally different, even in how our brains take them in. And that's, I think, where a lot of that also comes from, is we don't give the writing the time, the length of the space to actually be written language, but we're still taking it in as written language, which is where the entire inability to really get tone across in boards and forums and IRC and Twitter it comes from.
And also, that's another place where the plurality of ideas on the internet is its own. It hamstrings it, because you can sarcastically say something that would seem outrageous to you, but then I can read it and say, like, oh crap, is this person like actually a Nazi? Who knows? Because I've run into those on the internet.
Yeah, like sarcasm's so hard on the internet because every idea has been said legitimately somewhere because there's so many people. Like there's so many perspectives that like you aren't just in your circle where people understand you enough to understand what you would or wouldn't be sarcastic about or what you would or wouldn't joke about. Suddenly it's out there for everyone to see, and also because it's the internet, it's out there forever. You no longer have any control of who sees it or if it's remembered or anything like that. And that entirely changes how we should be using it to communicate, but it doesn't, which causes problems.
And it doesn't, because humans are not as rational as we pretend we are.
Never, yeah. Like, rationality is a struggle. Like, that's something that each individual has to fight for in their own mind, and the average person just by nature doesn't bother. Most people are entirely happy to be entirely emotional.
Well, and I think it's, I don't know, I'm coming to a realization, this might be just my personal development and whatnot, that we are just emotional beings, and thinking with emotion is part of our process. It's part of how we as humans work, and you can't separate that from the human condition.
Actually, that's something I really like to focus on. There is another big theme in Cyberpunk is what is intelligence? Like, is an artificial intelligence the same as human intelligence? That
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
especially consciousness, right? Like, is
Like,
a conscious sentient machine, can we talk about the human experience? They are obviously conscious and sentient. They do not have the human experience. So how do we describe or how do we define what being sentient is the huge cyberpunk thing.
yeah.
Oh, totally. I love it.
And I, like, personally, it's a playground I love to explore. Like, the idea that, okay, like, what would humans try to make? Like, are they going to try to make the emotional robot? Or are they going to make the logical machine that does the right, or that makes the logical decision?
Right, and I think there's something so human about the fact that almost every time we get into, okay, if we made the perfect logical machine, it's written almost as a horror thing. Like, people are actually afraid of the perfectly logical sentient creature.
With good reason. We have no comprehension of it.
Yeah, we can't picture that. So, and it's the base
vaguely
human nature.
Lovecraftian. It's
amazing.
It's
And
absolutely
it's the base
Lovecraftian.
human thing to be afraid if we can't understand, and we couldn't understand that. Like, it's something that a human can never be. We've never in nature to this point seen anything that is
No.
perfectly logical, unless you're talking possibly like when you get into the physical realm, like physics and the universe possibly is totally logical, but we also don't understand that yet.
And let's also not pretend for a minute that it makes sense to human understanding.
It doesn't, yeah.
That's actually a really interesting one, because the attitudes towards like purely logical artificial intelligences have changed severely over time. The contrast between HAL and GLaDOS, this is not an original take, but we know that things are wrong in 2001: A Space Odyssey when HAL starts acting like a computer instead of like a person. And then in Portal, we know that things are weird when GLaDOS stops acting like a computer and starts acting like a person.
Mm-hmm.
I love that perspective, and that's a really interesting thing to see going forward.
I mean, and that's I think that perfectly describes, there's two kind of camps about this, and we're starting to see this actually in legal places as well as the big corporations. Of the nerds who have done all of the reading and stuff like that are the ones who are going to appreciate the GLaDOS perspective, right? Like, when the logical computer starts acting emotionally, now be afraid. But in legislation that people are trying to talk about in the big corporations, you are hearing all of this. We need to come up with laws in advance of making the logical machine because we're afraid of it. And it's like it's almost the people who are really into, I don't want to say the genre, but like any genre that has that compared to the people who are just hearing about it for the first time. It's almost like those who have been reading about the logical machine for their entire lives have got to the point where they realize that the emotional one would be more terrifying. But all of the people for whom AI is a thing that they've only started hearing about when machine learning started coming around are still that like 20, 30, even 40 years back and are terrified of the logical one.
And that perspective plays out with a lot of what we term cyberpunk technology, like things like Alexa, Cortana, etc. The nerds who have been exposed to this kind of stuff forever see that shit as terrifying, and people
Freaky as hell.
Yeah, people who see this for the first time go, "Oh, this computer's my friend. That's fucking dope."
I'm Star Trek now. I can talk to my computer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I guess I'm just coming from this perspective of like there's a certain amount of hubris that comes from trying to create a logical machine and expecting anything of it because it will be so totally unlike us, and pretending that it would be is pretending that we have any way of understanding what it would do is again a horrid hubris.
That's actually on that point. Would we not know? All right, when you're designing it, we are creating the rules it works by, right? We're saying here's your methods to create or to understand and whatnot. And as we've shown through I can't think of any like brainwashing type examples, but I mean, if we want to look at the education system, we are taught to think a certain way. We're taught to go to class. You go to class at a certain time, bell rings, you go to lunch, blah, blah, blah. You get into those systems. We are already programming sentience to react a certain way. So what is it? Is there a stretch to say that we wouldn't be able to understand that, or we wouldn't be able to have that machine that we could predict and understand and ultimately control?
Absolutely, it is. For a start, we can barely control human children. That's why you have parents disowning their kids who turn out to be Nazis. And also, another point, we indoctrinate and bring up human children because we are human too. We have a point of empathy, we have a point of understanding. We know how people think because we are people. You see people bringing up people. We've developed this understanding of how to socialize and educate children from not only from thousands of years of building an education system and bringing up children, but because we have all evolved to process information in more or less the same way. Obviously everyone has a unique experience of the world and so on, but we process information more or less according to the same rules as each other. But we will never be able to have that with a computer because computers aren't like us, and we will project our prejudices and our beliefs onto the rules of the computer in ways that we won't even understand. I mean, look at the sexist Google image recognition for for a reference point, and yeah, we won't be able to understand the way it processes things. We'll try to explain it the way we do a human because that's going to be our default, and it won't work.
I think there's there's two really interesting sides to that problem. The first is if we created the perfectly logical machine, where and how much would we fail to understand what was coming out of it? But the other side is equally interesting to me, and it has been explored a little bit in Cyberpunk of because of how our brains work, because of how we design things, because of our loves and our fears, that sort of thing, is it actually possible for a human to create something that has nothing of a human in it?
No, absolutely not.
And like that's
You could
almost more worrying.
Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah, well, exactly, right? No, exactly is.
I'm leaving my audio on just so you can get the feeling of me staring at you silently.
But like that's a really interesting thing that I think Cyberpunk does well, of saying like everything a human has ever created has something of humanity in it, because we can't help it. Like we have no ability to create outside of the context of ourselves. And so anything we have created is going to be, of us. And like I think it's a bit outside of Cyberpunk, because it was really more early sci-fi. But let's talk about Asimov for a second. Of really every one of Asimov's like rules of robotics stories was about how humans trying to create the perfectly logical machine will fail, because we cannot come up with rules that actually force it to be perfectly logical.
That's fair. To kind of hammer down the point of we cannot create without kind of leaving a part of ourselves on it. Company I work at, we could go around through all of the devs' code banks, and you could pick out who wrote what code just based on like reading it. And you would say, "Oh, okay, this one belongs to so and so," and
there is some terrifying software out there that I know I've kind of interacted with negatively. It was, I think, originally, I want to say it was originally one of the 3-letter American agencies that made it, but it's also been researched in universities as well, of taking giant like blocks of text, and just from really tiny variations in word choices, or how you structure sentences, that sort of thing, being able to tie one, like it can be a 5-word sentence, and it can tie to a particular speaker just based on that sort of stuff. Like they can identify you in an entirely anonymous setting based on your word choices in as few as 5 to 6 word sentences.
and that's circumstantial, and you can't use it in court.
That to me is terrifying, but like comes directly from what you're talking about, Mocas, is like everyone has their own way of creating, and like we cannot get ourselves away from that. And like that's the thing I've struggled with, obviously, a lot of online. I try to intentionally use different words, write in different ways, because I know software like that exists, and I doubt I've ever succeeded. Like I don't know if it is possible to defeat something that does that, but it terrifies the shit out of me.
Not if it works on such small sample sizes.
Exactly. I don't know how much of a backlog it needs to compare to, but I know once it's got a profile for you built, it can detect on very tiny examples.
That's fucking horrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's where this is why we need Cyberpunk.
And it's also, like, when we talk about we've caught up to Cyberpunk, it's shit like this that we're talking about.
I'm not plugged into my computer right now. Although I want to be.
Maybe you're not.
Hey, I haven't got the USB stick installed yet.
Right. I mean, that brings us to another point, is we have the Internet of Things and Bitcoin, and anonymous people on Mongolian carpentry forum hunting down the GPS coordinates of ISIS training camps. So if you're trying to write cyberpunk fiction, like, what do you actually do to separate it from contemporary fiction? Like, we mentioned Watch Dogs 2 earlier, and I guess also the first one, but the second one's the good one. Trust me on that.
Me too.
If it had come out 10 years ago, it would have been cyberpunk sci-fi. Today it's just contemporary. Like, there's very little exaggeration in it. So what do you do about that?
And well, I mean, that's part of an open question, which is like the kind of meme term for it is cyberpunk dead? But it's can you still create cyberpunk content that isn't just contemporary? Is that even possible?
Well, yes and no. So if you look at it as strictly a genre level thing, you can hit all the beats and get the right themes. But you need to make sure that you kind of... It's the difference between a 1920s contemporary piece and a 1920s detective film.
Yeah, noir piece versus just 1920s. Like there are genre differences.
Yeah. So it's you can look at one, you watch like any Humphrey Bogart film or actually I don't know too much about the 1920s contemporary film stuff, but you watch one thing from that era and then you watch another thing from that era or of that same era, and you can kind of get the sense that okay, this is different. You watch a rom-com and then you watch a drama, you can get those differences. So in theory, yes, you can hit those beats and then you'll still get your cyberpunk.
I think
mean,
the big question there is like, if you're doing cyberpunk now, do you just do contemporary, or is there a requirement of trying to be slightly future? Like,
I think the issue is you won't be able to get the future without the contemporary affecting it so much that it just becomes speculative fiction.
mhm. But like, that was like, let's look all the way back at early Gibson and stuff like that. Of technically, what he was writing was speculative about the future, but still was accurate enough, it turned out, to be cyberpunk, right? And like, it's how now do you split the two if you're writing right now? And like, I don't really feel like just aesthetics. You can't. Could you do a
If
modern novel with just cyberpunk aesthetics and still be cyberpunk? I'm not sure.
if I may, William Gibson pattern recognition that had almost none of the aesthetic of cyberpunk, but was still so thoroughly a cyberpunk book. I don't know who here's read it, although I'm guessing that everyone here has.
I read the
Just
first half and then I lost it, as I lose every Gibson book I ever buy.
No, I haven't.
Damn
read
it, Garm. Well, it's a good fucking book, but it's contemporary fiction while also being thoroughly cyberpunk. And I think the way you do it is you focus on the cyber aspects of contemporary life, on data, on big data, on government overreach, on corporate infiltration of life, and you bring in the punk. You bring in the criticism, the consequences, the what happens when.
Yeah, I think I largely agree. Of either contemporary or close, like near future, as long as it has the punk aspect and is focusing on the cyber, I feel like you can do both. Like, you don't necessarily have to speculate anymore because of how cyber the modern life actually is. And like, that's the big difference from writing it however many decades ago, is you needed to speculate on the cyberpunk because the cyber part wasn't there. Whereas now that we're there, can you just do the punk and focus on that aspect of the day to day? And I kind of agree you can.
I don't know. It seems to me like it's a pretty straightforward thing. It's like, of course he can, because there's still stories that need to be told. And I don't know. I see a lot. This is gonna sound bad. I see a lot of cyberpunk moving one of two ways. One is people replace their cyberpunk novels with the Communist Manifesto, uh, and two is the rise of solarpunk as a genre, which is almost post cyberpunk. You know.
I'm not even familiar with it, to be honest.
Yeah, could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, okay. So solarpunk it's a punk aesthetic in that it's about, undermining undermining societal standards in sticking up for the little guy, but it's focused on this give me a second to try and figure out how to explain it. It's green construction. It's building rooftop gardens to grow food. It's solar panels everywhere. It's this idea of cutting off from the grid and surviving on your own and thriving on your own by building communities of trust and by you get power by your own windmill and your own solar plant. You get food from your neighbor's garden.
It sounds a little bit like cyberpunk without the grit and the grime.
It's honestly, in many ways, it's what it is. It in many ways projects a sort of like, all right, well, the cyberpunk dystopia has happened. Corporations have ruled and fucked the world, and here's how we're thriving despite them.
Yeah, it's the positive angle, right? Or trying to find a positive angle once the cyberpunk kind of warnings are too late.
The cyberpunk
Exactly.
good end, basically.
Exactly.
Cyberpunk good end. Yes.
It's the happily ever after.
It's kind of an interesting idea. I've never witnessed any of it, but
I've seen pictures, but I'm not really sure how that works out as like long form fiction.
I mean, I haven't seen a lot of long form fiction. I've seen mostly drabbles and plot bunnies and stuff based on images. I'll see if I can dig up some images and drop them into the Mumble chat thingy?
Yep.
Question mark? 1 second.
It certainly sounds interesting.
I'm looking at the TV tropes page for Solarpunk, and fun fact, quote, the genre started on Tumblr in 2014 from a single post. Solarpunk is a genre of speculative fiction that focuses on craftsmanship, community, and technology, powered by renewable energy, wrapped up in a coating of Art Nouveau blended with African and Asian drawings. It envisions a free and egalitarian world with a slight bend towards social anarchism. Standing as both a reaction to the nihilism of cyberpunk and a solution to a lot of the problems we face in the world, Solarpunk works look toward a brighter future, solar, while deliberately subverting the systems that keep that brighter future from happening. Punk. Man, when we go back to Midgardia, I should make like a Solarpunk campaign setting.
I mean, once again, I'm not sure what you'd actually do, but
Oh, I have some ideas.
Man, base everything around druids.
I mean, yes, but also, I mean, like, Solarpunk, as much as it's a utopian genre, perfect utopias don't exist. There will always be people who don't believe in the utopia. There will always be ways the utopia is on the brink, you know?
my god, can we crush the forces of counter-rebellion?
Oh, I'm thinking of something that's a little bit more nuanced and less Stalinist than that, question mark?
And that's it for part 2 of our talk on Cyberpunk. Tune in 2 weeks for part 3, the finale, and in the meantime, subscribe to our channel and check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Midgardia. See you next time.